Hey, First Assembly, this is Pastor Wes. It's so good to be with you tonight. I want to encourage you to grab a seat and let's get into the Word of God. Hey, so good to be with you this evening. If you are watching on Facebook, if you take a minute, hit the like button. If you're watching on YouTube, please hit the subscribe. And we'd love to hear from you. Comment, say hello. If you got a testimony or prayer request, man, we would love to hear about it. We have been in a series on heroes of the faith, and we're working through the names that you find in Hebrews chapter 11 and looking at their lives and saying, what can we learn from them and apply to our lives today? Because they did something. They accomplished something. There was something they learned or embraced that helped them to be remembered in the way of Hebrews chapter 11. And I think that if they can learn it, we can learn it, and we too can live a life that is memorable for the glory of God. And one of the things that we see is that each of them learned to walk in faith. They had their issues. They had their struggles. Some of them had some pretty big mess ups, but God never gave up on them, and God used them for His will. And the beautiful thing is that even though they fell short at times in their moments, they took a stand in faith and God worked through them. And I think if God can do that for them, then God can do that for us, because we all know that without faith it is impossible to please God. That's what it says. And the thing is, it doesn't matter the mistakes of our past. It still takes faith. It doesn't matter all the good things that we have done. It still takes faith to please God. So you can't please God without faith. And the thing is that when you obey God, it just never affects you. And I think this is such a big concept in our minds, because we tend to think that, man, if I sin, it just affects me. But it doesn't just affect you. When you struggle, it affects those that are around you, that are close to you. And the same is true of obedience. And when I obey God, it affects the people that are around me. I mean, you look at Abraham, who we read about in Hebrews chapter 11 a couple weeks ago. He was leaving where he was. He was going to a place that God was going to show him. And the thing is, it wasn't just Abraham. He was making that decision and making the journey, but his family, and that included Sarai, whose name was later changed to Sarah, and it was in Abraham's obedience to God that positioned Sarah for her obedience to God. You see, your obedience, your saying yes to God in the time of God, in the thing of God, is never just about you. Your obedience to God helps other people get in position for them to be obedient to God. You know, ask yourself this: would Sarah have had her moment if Abraham hadn't said yes first? If Abraham hadn't heard from the Lord say, I want to take you to a land I'll show you, so leave where you are. If he had not said yes to that, would Sarah had had the opportunity to say yes to what God was dealing with her about? And that's why how you live your life is so important. How we engage in obedience to God is critical in our lives and in the lives of people that are around us. And I know Abraham must have wrestled through all of the same emotions that we feel, you know, stepping out into something and leaving what we've known and leaving what's comfortable and familiar for us, you know, believing that God is saying something, but want to make sure it's not our flesh or just wishful thinking. You know, we can get so excited about something and then have this thought of, you know, what am I doing? I remember being 15 years old and feeling like God, called me into ministry. And so that's where I was working towards my life. And I remember the day that my parents drove me to Valley Forge Christian College in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, and unloaded my little 3 boxes of possessions into a tiny little room. And then I walked them out and I hugged them and kissed them and said goodbye. And I watched them, drive away. And I'm standing on the sidewalk, and you just have this thought of, what in the world did I just do? What have I just done? You know, who in the world am I to do this? And what if I fail? And just all these questions just come flooding in. But if we understood the influence that not just our lives have, but our hope has, our faith in God has, our saying yes to God can have an impact on the lives of people that are around us. You know, weightiness is challenging, but there's also, obedience can be challenging, but also obedience has with it a weightiness, that it's not just about our blessing. It is about our lives helping to position others for them to be moved forward in the plan that God has for their life. And sometimes we play a critical role in their journey. So it's never just about you. Our lives are not our own. I've said that all the time. And so because of Abraham's obedience, Sarah was positioned to be obedient in what God had for her. And God gave her a promise. And with her promise was a waiting period, and waiting kills us. In Genesis 17:15-16 says, "Then God said to Abraham regarding Sarai, your wife, her name will no longer be Sarai, but now her name will be Sarah, and I will bless her and give you a son from her. Yes, I will bless her richly, and she will become the mother of many nations. Kings of nations will be among her descendants." You know, at this time in her life, Sarah was 90 and Abraham was 100, and they hadn't been able to have children. They had been barren this whole time. And so we might look at this situation and this promise that God is giving them at their age and in their circumstance and say, listen, that's not looking good. I mean, I wouldn't bet money on that. And, sometimes you and I have dreams. We have things that we feel like God has spoken to us. But we sometimes look at our lives and say, I just don't know how it's going to happen. It doesn't look like it's going to become. But we have to hold on. We say, if I was younger, if I was less busy, if I was, out of debt, if I didn't think at this time in my life I would be divorced or widowed, and that just changes everything. But does it? If God has given you a promise, God has given you a promise. And I know that we feel sometimes like our lives just aren't the way we thought they would be or they're supposed, to be. But here's the thing. God had told Sarah 5 times that she was going to have a son and that a nation and kings would come out of her. And I told you last week, I don't think the devil cares if you have hopes and dreams as long as you think the time for them has passed. Because if you feel like, man, I had this promise, this dream that God gave me, but I didn't do it, and now it's too late, we sometimes live and have those very hopes and dreams become discouraging to us. And that's what the enemy wants to do in your life. He wants to discourage you. He wants to limit you. He wants to hold you back from the things that God says you can possess. Waiting creates pressure, and sometimes in that pressure we try to help God out. You want to move in the life, you want God to move in the life of one of your kids, and you pray for that son, you pray for that daughter, you pray for your spouse or your friend or your coworker, whoever it is. But whenever there's an issue, a bump in their life, we just want to jump in and take care of it for them because we don't want them to struggle, we don't want them to hurt. And God sometimes says, listen, you are getting in the way of what I'm trying to do in their life. In Genesis chapter 16, Sarah was feeling the pressure. She tried to help God out. She told Abraham, I want you to sleep with my handmaiden Hagar, and when you have a child with her, then God can just use that child to fulfill his promise, to us through that. But that wasn't the promise that God had given her. God's will is good, and our will is always going to be less than God. And so when I help God, I'm infusing my will into it, and it's not going to be as good as my simple obedience to his perfect will. Anytime you go outside God's will to try to accomplish God's will, you're going to have trouble. Anytime we go against the word to try to move God forward, it's going to create conflict. That's going to be bad. And so even though it was culturally acceptable in that day, that wasn't God's plan or the promise that he had given her. And they ended up, Abraham slept with Hagar, they ended up having a baby, and the baby's name was Ishmael, and that led to the conflict between the Arab and the Israeli people that still to this day, it's been thousands of years, still to this day is what's going on. See, anytime that our flesh gets involved to do the things, our flesh, all the emotion comes with it, the pride, the jealousy, the anger, all of our flesh gets involved in those very things. And so even though we feel like we're helping God out, what we're really doing is making the journey longer. We're pushing the promise down the road. It doesn't move it closer, it moves it further away because God has to work that out to bring us on to it. And so what you thought you were told doesn't line up with what you see. It creates a lot of turmoil in us. And I get that. Waiting kills our flesh. In Genesis chapter 18, Sarah was once again told the promise of God for her life. And she actually laughed. She laughed mockingly at the promise of God for her life. And she not only doubted that she could get pregnant, she doubted that Abraham, could get her pregnant. Their time had passed based on their age and their circumstances of their lives. It just wasn't really a good option. It wasn't realistic. And yet, we find her in Hebrews chapter 11. in this chapter of faith, of people of great faith. And I love it because it just simply tells me that it's never too late to say yes to God. That you could have messed up a bunch in the past, but I can say yes to God now, and God can move me forward towards the promise. And just because Sarah had given up on herself, God had not given up on her. And God hasn't given up on you. And you know, one of the things that I think we always have to guard our hearts against is God speaks a promise to us, and we want to find somebody more qualified, or we want to find our Hagar. You know, somebody we say, hey, listen, you ought to do this good thing. And someone that in our eyes is more qualified or capable, but God didn't ask them, God asked you. And so God is faithful to grow us to the place of faith. And that's what we see with Sarah. She went from laughing to believing. In Hebrews chapter 11 says, it was by faith that even Sarah was able to have a child. Though she was barren and was too old, she believed that God would keep his promise. Something changed in her heart, and she went from laughing to believing. In Genesis 18, she asked a question that is the big question of life for any believer. Is anything too hard for God? In Genesis 18, she's laughing. In Genesis 21, Isaac is born. And there were a couple of major things that happened between 18 and 21 that I think changed her heart and grew her to the place of faith, that she was willing to say, yes, I believe. And the very first one happened in the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And it was through the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. You can read about it in chapter 18. You can read about this Sodom and Gomorrah, that God showed his power to Sarah and Abraham at a whole new level. And they were able to see something that God said would happen. And then it happened right before their eyes. God said, I'm going to judge these cities. I'm going to destroy these cities for the sin that is there. And they heard God say it, and then they watched God do it. And when God says he will do something, he will do it. And this was on a large scale. When these twin cities were destroyed by God, they saw God not only destroy the cities, but they saw the mercifulness of God, the faithfulness of God, and that he saved Lot, who was Abraham's nephew, from that destruction. And they saw, Abraham and Sarah saw in a grand way the power of God and his faithfulness. The second time came in a different place, in a different way. Abraham and Sarah had traveled to a place known as Gerar shortly after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And it was there, Abraham's kind of in the town, he's kind of living, and he's realizing, you know, I don't know if you've ever been somewhere, you kind of realize everyone is staring at us. And Abraham has this moment. He realizes that while his wife is 90, she's beautiful, and he becomes very uncomfortable, kind of saying, you know what, I think they want my wife, and they might kill me and just take her. Sarah was a beautiful woman, and Abraham was afraid that this was going to happen. And so he told people that Sarah was his sister, not his wife. Now, when King Abimelech, who was the king of that area, heard that Sarah was Abraham's sister, not his wife, he sent for her and had her brought to the castle, or the kingdom, or not the castle, I don't know what it is, brought to the palace, and she was put in as one of the women in his harem. And I can only imagine what she must have felt. You know, here she is, someone's wife, and how betrayed and hurt she was that her husband, Abraham, in an attempt to save his own skin, lied about her and let her be taken to the palace and be put in a harem. Just because Abraham didn't want to stand up for her didn't mean that she was on her own, because God had a plan for her life. Even if people who should defend you don't, you need to know you are not alone. God has a plan for your life. And look what God does. In Genesis chapter 20, 3-7 says, but that night God came to Abimelech, who's the king, in a dream and told him, you're a dead man, for that woman you've taken is already married. But Abimelech had not slept with her yet. So he said, Lord, will you destroy an innocent nation? Didn't Abraham tell me she is my sister? And she herself said, yes, he is my brother. I acted in complete innocence. My hands are clean. In the dream, God responded, yes, I know you're innocent. That's why I kept you from sinning against me, and why I did not let you touch her. Now return the woman to her husband, and he will pray for you, for he is a prophet. Then you will live. But if you don't return her to him, you can be assured that you and your people will die. Listen, God don't play games. God is saying, I've got a plan for her life, and I'm saving. Even if her husband's not, I'm stepping in and saving it. And it goes on that if Sarah's release and return to her husband wasn't enough, what happens again shows even more of the power of God, that God is in control. So when Sarah was returned to Abraham, Kim Abimelech gave Abraham gifts. Abraham forgave him, and Abraham prayed for him. And what God did as a result of that prayer taught Sarah and Abraham even more about the power of God. Verses 17 and 18. Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, his wife, his female servants, so they could have children. For God had caused all the women to be infertile because of what happened with Abraham's wife, Sarah. God not only destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham and Sarah saw it. God closed the wombs of every woman under the influence of Abimelech because Sarah had been taken. And then he wouldn't let anyone get pregnant until Sarah was released, not just back to Abraham, but released back to the will of God for her life. And when she was let go, God reopened all the wombs of the women in Abimelech's land. Now, what did this show Sarah? But that God had the power to open and close the womb. God can destroy cities. God can handle what is going on externally of you, but God can also handle what's going on internally in you. All right, she was able to see power on a national scale at Sodom and Gomorrah, and then she saw him open and close the womb. See, God showed Sarah all of these things in external situations around her to strengthen the faith within her so that she would believe God for the impossible situation in her own life. See, when we're waiting on God for something, our faith can struggle. And God uses people and things around us to show us his power and strength and to encourage us. When people are given a testimony of what God has done in their life, it encourages us. It builds our faith for our situation. And we know that in Revelations 12:11 says they triumphed over him. They overcame the enemy. They overcame the battle in the enemy because of the blood of the Lamb, because of what Jesus has done, and by the word of their testimony. When people came together and shared with one another what God had done in their life, it encouraged and it built them up, and they overcame. That's why I tell folks, listen, when God answers a prayer, testify. Because it's not just about you. It's you giving thanks, but also your words of testimony build the faith of others who are listening, who hear it, and are waiting on God to do something in their life. This is part of why God tells us not to forsake the gathering of ourselves together. Because we need this in our life. We need this in our lives to help us grow and to build our faith, to believe God for what looks like an impossible situation to us. That's why your miracle or your breakthrough isn't just about you. That's why Sunday school matters, because of the discussions that take place. That's why small groups matter, because of the discussions that take place. That's why church matters, that we come together and we worship him because he's worthy of it. But also I'm rubbing iron, sharpening iron, and together we all learn and grow and encourage each other by what God is doing in our lives. Sarah's faith grew as she watched God move in the lives and the situations around her. It's amazing. In fact, it grew so much as she learned how to let go of some stuff. She had to let go of her logic. She had to stop looking at her situation and saying, I'm too old, my time has passed. And she had to start looking and saying, with God, all things are possible. She had to let go of her mocking laughter, saying there's no way this is going to happen, and start to believe that nothing is too hard for God. In Genesis 21:1-7, it says this, the Lord kept his word and did for Sarah exactly what he had promised. She became pregnant. She gave birth to a son for Abraham in his old age. This happened just at the time God said it would. And Abraham named their son Isaac. 8 days after Isaac was born, Abraham circumcised him as God had commanded. Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. And Sarah declared, God has brought me laughter. All who hear about this will laugh with me, not at me, with me. Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse a baby, and yet I have given Abraham a son in his old age? The name Isaac actually means laughter. Now, why does God put us in situations that seem impossible? And it's because he's the only one in those moments who gets the glory. It's not about how smart I am. It's not about how hard I work or how stubborn I can be and just not giving up on the dream. It's God shows up and everyone looks and goes, God showed up. He sometimes lets us hit rock bottom so we can discover He's the rock. He's the firm foundation on which we stand and put our trust. He might not change your situation or scenario until He sees that we are waiting well in it. And by that I mean waiting with hope and waiting with expectation. You know, the first time that Sarah laughed, she laughed at God. The second time she laughed with God. I love that. God sometimes lets our backs get against the wall, not to be mean, but so that He can show us His power. And Sarah had to grow and to mature to the point of waiting well. Now, did she make some mistakes along that way? Yes, she did. And so do we. You might even in your life have some Ishmaels running around. You've got situations, decisions you've made in your life that, man, oh man, if we could do them again, we'd do them again, but we can't. And there's Ishmaels that were born. And here's the thing, it's never too late for God to intervene into your life and to accomplish His will when we are willing to believe and have faith in Him. Sarah made a mess of things. Abraham lied and got even messier. And yet both of them witnessed the power of God and they understood to a deeper degree who God was. But here's the thing, it took both Abraham and Sarah to believe. In Hebrews 11:12 it says this, and so a nation came from this one man who was as good as dead. Talking about Abraham. That's encouraging, isn't it? A nation with so many people that like the stars in the sky and the sands on the seashore, there is no way to count them. It took both of them. Their miracle didn't come in division. And this is so important, especially in the context of marriage and believing, promises for your marriage. The enemy wants us divided. He wants to divide us because as long as we're divided, as long as we're doubting, as long as we're divided, we're going to be limited, especially in the context of marriage. And you see that with Abraham and Sarah. Now, and I think this is one of the biggest struggles in marriage in a lot of ways is that two people come together and make a marriage commitment, but they don't become one flesh in spirit and driving goal. They still are two different people trying to live simply together. Unity is necessary for God to deliver on His promise, especially when it comes to married folks. Sarah learned how to wait well, and that involved respecting and honoring those that are around her. You see, a lot of times what happens is we get in marriages and all of a sudden we're relationships, friendships, in a lot of ways this happens, and all of a sudden when things don't work out the way we hoped, we begin to blame. And blame tends to rise when simply things don't go as planned. And in our frustration and disappointment, we blame. We blame our spouse. We blame our boss. We blame our friends. We blame our parents, for things that they raised us like. And we do these things. But here's the deal. 1 Corinthians 13:7 says this. The Lord, love never gives up, never loses faith, is always hopeful, and endures in every circumstance. Listen to me. True love doesn't blame. It was when Sarah stopped blaming. She stopped trying to solve the problem herself. She stopped blaming Abraham for being too old that she got her miracle. When she stopped calling the shots in her marriage and saying, hey, Abraham, I know what God said, but here's what we're going to do. When she stopped calling the shots and started moving in obedience in the things of God, she got her miracle. And I love this. Sarah didn't die until she was 127 years old, which means that she was 90 when she had Eric. And she was able to have the family she always wanted for 37 years. Barren for 90 years. Blessed for 37 years. Peter tells us that when we wait well and we honor those that we are to honor, I don't have to live in fear. I don't have to let worries consume me. That when I honor the things around me and I trust the God before me, that God will make a way. And you got to know that God still gives promises today. And I love the fact that Sarah had decades to enjoy the promise of God in her life. Do you know that in all the scripture, from Genesis to Revelation, Sarah is the only woman whose age of death is given? Maybe it's because after that, God realized that women don't like to talk about their age. I don't know. But why would God let us know when she died and no other woman? And I think it's this, simply to show it's just never too late. It's never too late. It's never too late to say yes to God. God gives you time with the promise to accomplish what He wants to accomplish. The promise that God has for you, it isn't too late. It's not too late. Now, don't go jumping into a substitute. Don't go marrying a Hagar because you're trying to help the promise along. Wait for your Sarah. Wait for the timing of God and God to say now and yes, and wait well. Learn to wait well in your life for the promise of God in honor and hope and surrender to faith. And faith is not an emotion. It is sometimes stepping out of our comfort zone, and other times it's about showing restraint. Faith doesn't always look the same, but at its foundation is this reality and this trust that nothing is too hard for God. I read this story today that there was a man once in Ottawa, Canada, who fell on hard times and kind of ends up saying, I need to get money, and he robbed a bank. And when he robbed the bank, he got away with $6,000. That's how much he got when he robbed the bank. It was apparently a very small bank. But the interesting part of the story is this, that the gun that he used to rob the bank was a 1918 Colt revolver, and that gun was worth about $100,000. He literally could have just sold the gun that he had in his hand and made 10 times as much as he tried to steal. And simply because he didn't understand the value of what he had. Listen, God is with you. God is for you. God has promises for your life, and they're valuable. Don't not recognize, and that's a double negative. Don't miss the value of what you have in your life with God by faith. And do we run ahead sometimes? Yeah, we do. Do we make mistakes? Yes, we sometimes make mistakes. But don't settle for a substitute. Don't settle or become content with living your life with resentment or bitterness, or be consumed with the spirit of blame. Because only if they hadn't, and they shouldn't have, and that never should have happened, if only we're so good at blaming everything else. But understand the value of what you have in God by faith, and trust Him for the fullness of the promise in your life, because there is nothing too hard for God. Amen. I love you. First Assembly, a couple of things, man. There's a Thanksgiving outreach this Saturday. They're going to be leaving church at 10 o'clock. They're going to go out and bless 30 families with full Thanksgiving dinners. This coming Sunday, we're receiving a Thanksgiving offering. You can bring it with you in person. You can give online. Just write Thanksgiving offering. And this is just something at the end of the year, towards the end of the year, we just take a little bit of time and we just say, God, we want to thank you for how good you have been to us. And I want to encourage you to pray what the Lord would have you to give, and be faithful to that. This coming Sunday, Pastor Gerald, Evangelist Gerald Fire Shut Up in the Bones Mahan, is going to be bringing the word. So I'm excited about that. Feel free to tune in or join us 10:30 in the morning. Next Wednesday, the day before Thanksgiving, we are not having service. So the church is going to be closed that day. There won't be anything online, so you can join us the following Wednesday, or the Sunday after will be great. And if you're coming tonight, man, please make sure you watch your step. A lot of construction's going on. We're ripping up carpet and flooring, and building looks like there's construction going on with it. So please be careful and pray for us, and we continue to build His house, and I'm excited about it. First Assembly, I love you and I bless you, and I pray God's face always shine upon you. Have a great week, and tell somebody about Jesus.